Welcome back to Hinduism. In this video, we're going to look at the Sankhya and Yoga schools of Hindu philosophy. Sankhya is the oldest school of Hindu philosophy. It dates back to the early sects and schools of the Shramana or renunciate movement of around the 6th century BCE. These different schools of thought are characterized by different theories of being or reality, that's metaphysics, a different theory of the gods or theology, and a different soteriology or theory of salvation. Many schools of thought that originated in India also had different epistemologies or theories of knowledge. In terms of metaphysics, Sankhya is a dualistic school. That means they believe there's two fundamental types of being or reality. For Sankhya, the two types of being or reality are Purusha and Prakriti. Now, most dualist schools of philosophy, both in India and in the West and elsewhere, posit two main types of substance, such as mind and matter. Those are the most common ones. Purusha and Prakriti are similar to the ordinary concepts of mind and matter, but they're a little different. Purusha means person, and it is an immortal, imperceptible soul. So it basically means consciousness or awareness. However, in Sankhya, Purusha only includes pure consciousness or pure awareness itself. So Prakriti or matter includes everything that's not pure consciousness. So every object of consciousness, everything that you're aware of, actually counts as Prakriti. So that does include physical objects like a table or chairs or your body, but Prakriti also includes what you could call mental objects like your thoughts, feelings, memories, etc. So the Purusha is the awareness itself, whereas the Prakriti is the objects of awareness, whether physical or mental. In Sankhya philosophy, there is no single cosmic Purusha or cosmic soul. Every being in samsara, that is, every being that is reincarnated into a human, animal, or other body, has its own Purusha or its own soul. So even though Sankhya is a Hindu sect because it acknowledges the authority of the Veda, it has a different philosophy than what you see in the Upanishads. In the Hindu texts known as the Upanishads, they posit a cosmic self or Atman. That would basically be a Purusha shared by all beings. But that's not the view of Sankhya. It's individual, distinct souls. In positing individual, distinct souls, Sankhya actually resembles Jainism, which also rejects the notion of a cosmic self, Atman, or a supreme being, Brahman, and regards each soul as separate and requiring its own salvation. So it's possible that Sankhya was influenced by Jainism in that respect. Sankhya was quite influential on later Hindu philosophy because of its analysis of Prakriti or matter. In fact, the name Sankhya can be translated as analysis, distinguishing between different kinds of things. The ultimate purpose of this, in terms of salvation of the soul, is for the soul to realize its true nature, which is pure consciousness. And everything else that you analyze reality into, you realize is not your soul or not self. And all of those not self or not soul things are Prakriti. So part of the elaborate analysis of Prakriti is the three gunas or the three qualities. There are other types of Prakriti, but these are kind of like three elemental essences. And the theory of the three gunas was influential in later Indian thought. So these are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Sattva means purity, Rajas means passion or energy, and Tamas means solidity or earth. Well, it's related to the earth element. In terms of theology, Sankhya does not believe in Brahman or a supreme being. Sankhya believes in many gods or devas, but unlike most other Hindus, they don't believe in a single supreme being that creates the other gods or devas in the whole universe. So for Sankhya, there is a world or a universe with many worlds. There are gods in the world, the devas, and there are other souls in the world. The gods, the devas, are above the status of humans and animals, but they're all part of the cycle of samsara. So the gods are not thought of as a vehicle for salvation in Sankhya. This view of the gods is often called, quote, atheistic, unquote, in Hinduism. It's not that an atheist school of thought like Sankhya literally believes there are no gods. They believe in the devas, or gods that are worshipped in the Veda. But what they deny is the existence of a single, all-powerful, all-knowing supreme God, or Brahman. So they're called non-theistic in that respect. So what is the theory of salvation in Sankhya if there's no all-powerful God or supreme being? They think that each soul is on its own to attain liberation or moksha by realizing the nature of their self, that their purusha or consciousness is separate from all perceptible objects, all types of prakriti. And this process is known as kaivalya, or separation. That's the goal. That's basically the term for moksha or spiritual liberation in Sankhya. Notice the similarity between the Sankhya term kaivalya and the notion of kevala jnana in Jainism. That's the theory of salvation in Jainism, where each soul separates itself out from everything else. So it does seem that Jainism has influenced Sankhya to a great degree. The important difference is that unlike Jainism, Sankhya does say, yes, the Veda is an authoritative, authentic scripture, and the gods in the Veda exist and are worthy of worship or sacrifice. The picture shows Kapila, who's regarded as the founder of Sankhya. Not much is known about him. He may have been a legendary figure, but if he was real, he was probably somewhere between the 7th and 6th century BCE. This is actually a picture of a story in which King Anshuman goes looking for a missing horse, and he's basically able to find it with the help of Kapila. The yoga school is another school of Hindu philosophy. It may be the second oldest after Sankhya. The yoga school is being treated here paired alongside Sankhya because yoga was actually influenced by Sankhya in terms of its metaphysics. So like Sankhya, yoga is a dualistic school. There are many different treatises giving an outline of the doctrines and practices of yoga. In other words, there's no single authoritative yoga text traditionally. There are many different yoga sutras. However, the one that's most famous is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You can see a later sculpture of Patanjali shown on the right. This is the basis for yoga that's most commonly studied today. It's called ashtanga, or 8-limbed yoga, because it has 8 main parts that we'll cover in the next slide. But the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are actually just an outline or summary of yoga. So it would probably be used as a teacher as a kind of set of reminders for their students on the main themes and topics. And then each part or each line of the sutra would be expanded in more detail by the teacher to the student. Nevertheless, we can learn a lot about this ancient school of yoga by examining texts like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So as mentioned, the metaphysics was influenced by Sankhya, so it's dualistic. There's a dichotomy between Purusha, which is pure mind or pure consciousness, and everything else. However, unlike Sankhya, yoga has a theistic theology. That means they believe in a supreme being or God, whom they usually refer to as Ishvara. So this is something that yoga has in common with bhakti, or devotional Hinduism. They practice reverence for and love for a supreme being. The difference between yoga and ordinary bhakti is that in bhakti, the commitment to and love for God is itself supposed to be a path for salvation. Whereas in yoga, God is more thought of as the end goal. It's what you're trying to unite your individual soul with. However, the path that's recommended, the theory of salvation or soteriology, is a systematic path of training of the mind and body. So it's a mental and physical training that's outlined systematically in the Yoga Sutras. And they do call the state of salvation kaivalya, like Sankhya philosophy. So A difference between the yoga school's philosophy, you might say, and the Upanishads is that at least the early Upanishads are often highly monistic. They seem to regard all of reality as one in some strong sense, such as positing that the souls of incarnated beings like humans, other animals, and other beings in samsara, they ultimately share one true soul or one true self, Atman. So we're all kind of different aspects of one supreme self. That's not the view of yoga. And this is something that is also true of many or most Bhakti Hindus. They regard the supreme God as a creator separate from the creation. So the individual souls of people have a distinct identity from God. What's happening in salvation is that your soul is basically in a state of perpetual union with God, but you're never truly identical to God, unlike the message you get in some of the Upanishads. Now, this sculpture of Patanjali is worth remarking on. The coiled serpent at the base of the figure is actually a symbol of Kundalini energy, which we'll talk about in the video on Tantra. Basically, Kundalini is a coiled serpent, and it's a symbol of this kind of potential energy you have at the base of your spine. It's like a vital energy, but it's in a kind of gross material physical form. And through the practice of yoga, you can awaken that energy and it travels up your spine and contributes to the process of enlightenment or union with God, as it would be phrased in the yoga school. Also notice the seven-headed serpent above the head of Patanjali. This is also a common image in Hinduism. You usually see it with images of the god Vishnu. It's the king of the Nagas, Shesha, who's loyally protecting Vishnu. In this case, though, he's hovering over and protecting Patanjali. You also see similar imagery of a serpent spirit guarding or protecting the Buddha or other saints of Indian sects. And as a reminder, the serpent is not always a symbol of evil in Hinduism. In this context, it just refers to a type of nature spirit who's showing his devotion and faith to this saint Patanjali, and it's not indicating anything evil. So let's talk about the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. There were different series of yoga in ancient times. Some of them had 6 limbs, for example. Some of them had more. Nowadays, Ashtanga or 8-limbed yoga is the most common because of the great influence of Patanjali. But just be aware that there was a variety of systems and doctrines taught historically. So we'll go through each of these in a bit more detail, but here's a quick summary. Yama is the moral rules, and these are basically a list of don'ts or thou shalt nots, things that you should avoid doing. Niyama is good habits that you want to cultivate. Asana is postures. These can include like sitting in a lotus posture with your legs crossed, or other types of postures that you want to be able to hold in a stable fashion for a long time. So the original purpose of developing the posture was essentially to give yourself a stable base for meditation. You can sit or stand in one pose for a long time. It facilitates the process of your mind focusing and calming down. Pranayama means breath control. This is, for example, controlling your in and out breathing, maybe holding your breath. There's various different techniques that are used, breathing in more forcefully or out more forcefully, etc. Pratyahara is withdrawal of the senses. This means you're focusing your attention within instead of looking outward to the world. And this is basically facilitating meditation where you're trying to discover your true self or your true nature. Dharana is concentration. And so this is when you're focusing on one object, such as the in and out breath or a mantra like the syllable Om, and that becomes the object of your meditation. Dhyana can be translated as contemplation, and this means when the mind is relatively fixed and absorbed on its object. So dharana is just when you're placing your mind deliberately onto the breath or some object. Dhyana is where it's actually sticking there, and you get into kind of like a smooth flow of calm and concentration. Samadhi in yoga means complete absorption into or union with God. And this can be either a temporary state that you attain as a result of developing your dhyana or contemplation, or it can be the equivalent of moksha or liberation. So if you practice the meditation enough, it will eventually result in your soul becoming permanently united with God, and that is salvation. Notice the last three of these are really dedicated explicitly to meditation. And the philosophy of yoga is it's moving from the first limb, which is relatively about outer action, to the last limb, which is about your inner union with God. So it's moving from the outside affairs to the inside. And the purpose of all of the limbs, the moral rules, the habits, the postures, breath control, is to facilitate the meditation. So the meditation is the main practice of yoga. That's its main type of spiritual discipline, as opposed to Bhakti Hinduism, for example, which focuses more on faith or devotion. So we're going to go through some of these limbs in more detail. Yama, or moral rules, includes 5 different aspects. And one thing that's worth mentioning with regards to yoga is that it was probably influenced by Buddhism and Jainism in terms of creating these systematic, numbered, or ordered lists of practice. So even though a lot of the steps or limbs of yoga were present in earlier forms of Hinduism, like the renunciation practice by the authors of the Upanishads, the idea of presenting things as a systematic list or path really arises with the Jains and the Buddhists. Like, for example, the Buddhists, they don't have the 8 limbs of yoga, but they have what's called the Noble Eightfold Path. The steps of the path in Buddhism are different from the 8 limbs of yoga, but that general idea probably influenced yoga. Another example is there are 5 moral precepts or 5 vows in Buddhism that are slightly different in the details, but similar to the 5 yamas of yoga. Ahimsa means nonviolence, which means not harming any living creature, including animals. The picture on the right is of a hand with ahimsa written in the center. This is actually an image usually used in Jainism because that religion places a big emphasis on nonviolence. Jains are strict vegetarians, for example, and believe it's wrong to kill an animal or even harm one. But that emphasis on nonviolence probably had an influence on yoga and other forms of Hinduism. So it became taboo among some Hindus, for example, to eat meat. There are some Hindu vegetarians, even to modern times. Satya is truth, and that means honesty, sincerity, not lying. Asteya means not stealing and not taking something unless it's been offered to you. Brahmacharya means chastity. So it basically means no sexual contact of any kind. Sex is regarded as basically the strongest pleasure, and desire for sex the strongest passion. So it's the thing that's maybe most likely or highly likely to keep your soul trapped in samsara. Aparigraha means non-grasping. So this basically means not being attached to things and not hankering after them all the time. There's definitely a sense you get from a lot of the ancient Indian sects and schools of thought that grasping, that psychological principle, is ultimately what keeps your soul trapped in samsara. So the yamas are things you're not supposed to do. The niyamas are things you should do and cultivate as habits. Shocha means purity, so both of your mind and of your body, like cleanliness. Santosha means contentment. So it's not having a lot of needs or a lot of possessions. It's being content with little, or being content psychologically with the circumstances of your life. Tapas means exertion and effort. So yoga is not something that can just happen naturally or spontaneously. It's not really about just going with the flow. You have to put an effort into the practice in order to get the results. And you can see that idea actually present in most, if not all, of the ancient Indian sects that practice meditation. It's not necessarily just go with the flow. That might be what happens when you perfect meditation, like in yoga, for example. If you attain samadhi, then you may not have to exert effort to stay one with God. But certainly to get to that state, it takes a lot of work. Svadhyaya means self-study. So instead of focusing on studying the Veda, for example, or other types of scholastic works, yoga advocates studying your own mind or consciousness through meditation. And that's ultimately how you end up relinquishing your attachments and uniting with God. And Ishvara Pranadhana means contemplation of God, or Ishvara. Ishvara is the usual name or title given to the Supreme Being in yoga. And so this is basically something you want to do, is reflecting on God's nature. It's a good habit. It's not the same as samadhi or union with God in terms of the depth of your consciousness, but it's sort of like a habit of contemplation that will facilitate your perfection of meditation. And you can see the yogi on the right is displaying one of the asanas or postures. In traditional yoga, you don't necessarily go through the asanas in a rapid sequence like most modern practitioners of yoga. You would hold a pose for a long time and then practice meditation when you're holding that pose. So let's talk a bit more about the difference between the yoga school of philosophy and other types of yoga, including Hatha Yoga and modern yoga. So the yoga school, as mentioned, does focus on meditation practices as the main way to attain moksha. Breath control was also important as a preliminary step to supporting meditation. So if you are controlling the breath in and out, that can basically help clarify, cleanse your mind to prepare it for focusing for long periods. In Hatha Yoga, this was something developed in ancient India, but it's a type of yoga that focused more on breath control. So breath control is a step in Patanjali's 8 limbs of yoga, but it's not something he expands on in great length. There were other basically sects or schools of yoga that focused more on breath control and the other physical practices, and this is called Hatha or forceful yoga. And you can see this in modern yoga as well. There is a lot of emphasis placed on different types of breathing, like for example, breathing in one nostril, out another, and so on. Modern yoga, though, is quite distinct from traditional schools of yoga because of the great emphasis placed on the postures or asanas. And so modern yoga does have its roots in the yoga school of thought and in Hatha Yoga that go back to ancient times. But yoga as we know it today, like what you would learn, if you go to a gym or watch a video on YouTube, is going to be mainly based on a sequence of postures developed in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in addition to being influenced by the Indian yoga tradition, it was highly influenced by 19th century European calisthenics, a type of like gymnastic exercise. And so it was kind of created by teachers in India in the 1800s, partly, just for health and wellness, but also as a way of bringing some of the other practices of the yoga school to a wider audience, something that could be practiced by lay people as opposed to by sannyasins or yogis who spend their whole life in renunciation. The picture on the right is of some yoginis or female yogis. These were not as common historically in India. So most people who lived as a sannyasin or renunciate and who practiced yoga or another path, they were men, oftentimes of the Brahmin or another higher caste. However, as this miniature indicates, there were women who were seriously devoted to yoga as well. Interesting thing about modern yoga, especially outside of India, most of the practitioners are female, but this is actually the reverse of what was true historically in India.